A prisoner swap between the U.S. and Iran. It's a rare agreement between two nations long at odds on nearly all fronts. So, does this deal signal a new dawn in relations, or is it just a one-off? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Iran and the United States rarely agree on anything, so a deal to swap prisoners is a rare event. 2 years of delicate negotiations brokered by Qatar bore fruit on Monday, with inmates released by both sides. 2 of the Iranians have opted to stay in the U.S., with another going to an undisclosed country, while 2 are back in Tehran. The 5 released by Iran are back in the U.S. $6 billion of Iranian assets have also been unfrozen. We'll be discussing the significance of all this with our guests shortly. But first, here's a report from Kulsum Sharif on a rare day of cooperation between the U.S. and Iran.
Emotional scenes as 5 Americans held by Tehran for years arrived at this airport in Qatar's capital, Doha. In exchange, Washington released 5 Iranians and unblocked $6 billion in frozen Iranian oil funds. The high-stakes diplomatic deal was negotiated by Qatar over 2 years.
At many points, there was no light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to these mediations. Both sides, during the negotiations, went through a lot of difficulty to get the final language that was approved over the financial humanitarian channel and also over the prisoner exchange.
The prisoner swap is the first deal in years between 2 long-time adversaries. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi called it a humanitarian move.
When the issue of prisoner swap was raised, we announced that we were ready to do the swap as a completely humanitarian work. Definitely, this humanitarian act could be a step between Iran and America.
U.S. President Joe Biden issued a statement saying he celebrated the return of the Americans but would continue to impose sanctions on Iran for its provocative actions. His top diplomat, Antony Blinken, said the swap and negotiations on the nuclear deal are not linked.
The freedom of these unjustly detained Americans has always been a separate track in our engagement, or for that matter, lack of engagement with Iran. So irrespective of what was happening or not happening, for example, in pursuing the effort to return to the nuclear agreement, we've been focused on working independently to bring these Americans home.
Both sides have been hostile since the 1979 revolution in Iran. Washington has long opposed Tehran expanding its nuclear program and its close ties with Russia. And Iran has been angered by U.S. support for Israel and involvement in Middle East politics, as well as its imposition of sanctions. But tensions have escalated after 2018, when then-President Donald Trump pulled out of an internationally brokered deal for Iran to scale back on its nuclear program in exchange for lifting of sanctions. Biden says he wants to return to the deal as long as Iran complies, but a new agreement has not yet been reached.
This could be a beginning for extended and further talks on nuclear negotiations, as well as lifting the sanctions against Iran. But there's an issue whether that the Americans will be able to do it before their election in the U.S. or not.
The U.S. says Qatar will ensure Iran's money unfrozen under the prisoner swap deal will only be spent on humanitarian needs such as food and medicine. That will be welcome in Iran that's in the grip of an economic crisis with soaring inflation and unemployment. But in the U.S., Republicans are denouncing the prisoner swap as a ransom payment. Kulsum Sharif for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Joining us from Tehran is Foad Izadi. He's the head of the American Studies Department at the University of Tehran and a specialist in U.S.-Iran relations. Roxane Farmanfarmaian joins us from London. She's a lecturer in modern Middle East politics at the University of Cambridge and a specialist on Middle East security. And Scott Lucas joins us from Birmingham. He's a professor of U.S. and international relations at University College Dublin and the founder and editor of the online news site E-A Worldview. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Foad, let me start with you today. Iran and the U.S. have carried out a prisoner swap as part of a Qatar-mediated deal. Experts believe that this prisoner swap may be a step toward de-escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran. What do you think? Is this just a one-off, or could this lead potentially to a thaw in relations?
You know, I don't think it's going to be a major shift in U.S. policy towards Iran. I think the Biden administration either is unwilling or unable to correct the past mistakes of previous administrations and come to a policy that's actually working for the United States. But I think if you get these type of agreements, small agreements, you can eventually reach a stage where the confrontation is not something that both sides worry about on a daily basis. So it's not going to resolve any major issues, but I think it's one step in the right direction.
Yeah, Foad, and that's what I actually wanted to follow up and ask you about next, because President Raisi, when he arrived in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, he told media there that this could be a step in the direction of a humanitarian action between us and America. I mean, at the very least, do you think that this could lead to more dialogue?
You know, Iran and the United States have been talking for many years. During the Obama administration, Iran's foreign minister broke all the records with regard to the number of hours that he negotiated with the U.S. foreign minister. That's Javad Zarif and John Kerry. And Iran and United States have been indirectly talking for many, many months now. So that's not a major problem. The problem is basically the difficulties that we have in the U.S. Congress. We have the Republicans that oppose any type of reapproachment with Iran or lowering of tensions with Iran. And we have some powerful Democrats like Robert Menendez, who's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the U.S. Senate, that are not in line with the Biden administration's policies towards Iran. He opposed the nuclear agreement in 2015. He opposes the nuclear agreement now. I think that level of confrontation is much more in Washington when you compare that to Tehran. In Tehran, generally, people want to see lesser tensions between Iran and the United States.
Roxane, I saw you reacting to some of what Foad was saying, so I'm going to give you a chance to jump in. And I want to get your take on this. I mean, what do you say? Is this prisoner exchange going to lead to more dialogue between the U.S. and Iran? You know, Iran and the U.S. rarely agree on anything, so this is clearly a rare event. How significant is it?
Well, I think it certainly was a prerequisite to then proceeding on to possibly restarting the nuclear negotiations. I think it is indicative of the fact that there are going to be small de-escalatory steps that are taken. I think both Iran and the United States are seeing the advantage of undergoing and undertaking transactional deals that are limited in scope and where both countries can claim a win. And this definitely fell into that category. So I think there will be future smaller scale negotiations. There are a number of pots of money of Iran's all over the world. So there's possibly one already being discussed that is sitting in Japan. And every one of these negotiations, there are elements that both sides can win or can gain from, and then both sides have a degree of compromise that they can offer. So I think they're trying to reduce the temperature at the moment, and I think what we're going to see is quite a few of these where both states are trying to get something out of it, particularly as Biden moves into an election year. And in Iran, of course, the presidential election is only 6 months after the American election. So they too will be looking for specific areas of achievement in these negotiations.
Scott, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken seemed to leave the door open to potential diplomacy on the nuclear file going forward. He described it as perhaps the #1 issue of concern, but he also suggested that nothing was imminent. Do you think this is the stance of the Biden administration behind the scenes as well?
The reflection of reality. The ball is in Tehran's court on the broader question regarding the nuclear talks. And I think Dr. Izadi gave us a very important clue here, which is that they have no real willingness at this point to really drive those talks forward. Let's get some facts on the table that are very important here. First of all, the past. In early 2022, we were close to a settlement to revive the 2015 nuclear deal, getting the Americans back in after the Trump administration's withdrawal, beginning to lift American sanctions, and it was Iran that backed away. They backed away initially over the question of the status of the Revolutionary Guards. Then they backed away crucially over the question of inspections of nuclear facilities to September 2023. And that is, even as you and I are talking about, thank goodness, the release of these hostages from Iran in exchange for the $6 billion in Iranian funds, Iran has stepped up the restrictions on the inspections of the nuclear facilities. They are refusing to give up the video surveillance tapes. They are refusing to put cameras back into the facilities. And in the past few days, they have withdrawn the accreditation, de-designation it's called, from 1/3 of the IAEA inspectors. So in other words, they're taking a harder line on inspections as they continue to step up production of uranium in violation of the 2015 agreement. So while the foreign ministry says we want a deal with the Americans, they said that 2 weeks ago, other elements in the Iranian leadership are taking that harder line, which is we, in fact, are not giving any ground on inspections or on verification of our nuclear program. And I think Dr. Izadi's stance that he's not expecting a breakthrough in the talks, it reflects that Iranian leadership's position.
Fuad, did you have any reaction to what Scott was saying there? Because he was saying that essentially Iran is taking a harder line towards inspections by the IAEA. And I want to get your take on this. I mean, when it comes to potentially getting around a negotiating table again for the JCPOA, for the nuclear deal, is that something you can see happening? Can progress actually be made?
I agree with Scott. Iran is taking a harder line. And the reason is that the announcement for what Iran has been doing in the last number of days came after the European members of JCPOA, France, UK, and Germany, announced that October 26th, when the sanctions, a number of sanctions on Iran under JCPOA is supposed to be lifted, they are not going to accept that part of JCPOA. They are going to do what the Americans did in 2018. In 2018, Trump left the nuclear agreement, and the Europeans, a few days ago, announced that they are going to officially violate the nuclear agreement. You know, it is not possible for Iran to unilaterally follow a multilateral agreement. If the other side leaves the agreement, if they don't want to follow their part of the bargain, it's not logical for Iran to follow what Iran is supposed to do. And the basic message is that if you cause difficulties for Iran, if you violate the agreement that was agreed upon in 2015, that's going to have some cost. And the cost is you are not going to have as much as access as you had before. What Scott said is correct. So when you don't allow 1/3 of the inspectors to continue their work, that means that 2/3 of the inspectors are continuing their inspection. So it's, you know, the coin has two sides.
Scott, I know you want to jump in, but I need to get a question to Roxane first, and then I'll give you an opportunity. Roxane, I want to take a step back for a moment. You know, getting to this point when it comes to the prisoners swap, it took 2 years of intense negotiations that were mediated by Qatar. This has been a successful outcome for Qatar, but the second year of the negotiations saw mediators shuttling between hotels in Doha. That means that both sides of this, the Americans and the Iranians, never met face to face. So I want to ask you just how difficult it was to get to this point.
Well, the Iranians and the Americans have made an art out of negotiating without being face to face. The same thing was going on in Vienna during the JCPOA negotiations, where it was the Europeans that were shuttling between them. So I think it's very difficult. I think it's when people do establish rapport personally that, greater breakthroughs can take place. But I think this is the landscape. And to go and address a couple of the points that both the other guests have made, it is a very toxic and extremely dangerous landscape. And I think it's always easy for one side or another to point out what either Iran or the United States has done. But it's just been a series of usually setbacks and then the occasional breakthroughs, because another thing, of course, that happened right before the prisoner swap, 24 hours before, was that the United States imposed further sanctions on Iran due to the Masa Amini situation. It happened to be an anniversary right at that point. And they imposed sanctions on further authorities in Iran that are in the security area. So it just doesn't help very much, in my view, to look at a tit for tat. What I think is important is for us to see that it's a very high priority. Blinken has made this clear for the United States to begin to help to reduce the amount of stockpiling that's going on. And I think Iran sent a signal about that, in that as the negotiations for the prisoner swap were wrapping up, it dropped its stockpiling of 60% enriched uranium for the first time. So I think it's these subtle signals that need to be picked up that can be the indicator that actually there is very much a chance of a next step.
Scott, all right. I saw you also reacting to some of what Roxane was saying there, too. So please go ahead.
Professor Farmanfarmaian has put it very, very well in terms of reading the signals that are coming from both sides. So it's important to look further ahead. Dr. Izadi's argument that this is all because the European powers said that they were not going to lift all the measures come October is quite frankly a bit of nonsense. The fact of the matter is that to expect the European powers, let alone the United States, to withdraw all the provisions of the 2015 nuclear deal, given that Iran has stockpiled 60% uranium, even though it has slowed the production down slightly in the last quarter, to expect everyone to effectively say, well, that's it. There's absolutely no reason why Iran should have any terms with which it has to comply. That's ridiculous. And so for Iran to then put its fist down and say, well, that's it. We're going to restrict inspectors. We're going to continue, as we have done for 2 years, to not allow any access to video of our nuclear facilities. At some point, because of the Iranian economy, although this will be assuaged a bit by the $6 billion they're getting under the terms of the release of the political prisoners, at some point, because of the Iranian economy, they're going to have to come in from the cold and talk seriously about trying to get an agreement, which on the one hand does begin to lift the American sanctions, does begin to remove those sanctions that have been in place for years, gets the U.S. back in the agreement, but also returns Iran to the compliance of the nuclear deal, which says 3.67% uranium production is what you responsibly should be producing. Now, at this point, when they're producing 60%, that's a huge gap. And I'm afraid that's a gap that may not be easily managed before we get into the U.S. and the Iranian parliamentary elections in 2024.
Scott, you mentioned something that I wanted to ask you about next, the $6 billion in unfrozen assets. You also said something that made me think of that. You talked about signals coming from both sides. And what I'm getting at here is the fact that in the past couple of weeks, you've heard different officials in the U.S. and in Iran describing how this money could be used. So you have U.S. officials maintaining that these funds can only be used for humanitarian needs, but there are also Iranian officials who over the course of the last couple of weeks have suggested the money could be spent wherever they want to spend it. Which is it? I mean, is this up for debate, or is this something that has been clearly delineated in this agreement?
Under the terms of the deal, that $6 billion is to be managed coming out of Qatar. It is to be overseen there. It is not being overseen by Iranian officials. It is to be dispensed for food for medical items, for other items that are deemed to be humanitarian. So as the head of the central bank in Iran admitted a few weeks ago when this deal was being struck, no, Iranian officials do not control that $6 billion. And for President Raisi to say otherwise, it's misleading, probably for domestic consumption. Now, it is the case, and this is something which people are debating, that Iran does have a bit of flexibility because money that it spends on food and medicine internally, now that it can draw it from the $6 billion pot, they could use that money for food and medicine for other items. They could use it for other domestic programs. They could even use it for the military, a point that critics of the deal have been pointing out. But no, on the fundamentals, Iran does not have unrestricted access to that $6 billion when it is finally placed in Qatar and overseen by Qatari authorities.
Roxane, earlier you talked about the fact that President Biden is heading into an election year in the U.S. in 2024. And I want to ask you how this deal might impact him politically in the U.S. going forward and how worried the Biden administration might be when it comes to the ramification of it. Because we've kind of seen the Biden administration be a little bit on the defensive about this, saying that this was not a ransom, talking about how they are still taking a tough stance toward Iran. So is there a lot of concern privately amongst Biden officials about how this could impact him? And could it have negative ramifications on him domestically in the U.S. going forward?
Well, of course, the opposition, the Republicans are going to make this case. But the fact is that this is Iranian money. It is not a ransom. And in fact, my understanding of the terms is that should there be any abuse or lack of transparency, that the United States can restrict the further use of whatever funds remain. So it's got a safety latch on it. And in terms of where Biden is going with this, I think the humanitarian side is a big plus for him. And he is that kind of president that emphasizes that kind of thing. And so it was a big PR day for him and played well in that situation. And I think, yes, the concern on the part of the Republicans is that there will be expenditures possibly in areas now that the Iranians can direct these funds to, where in the past they were buying food and medicine. But if you look at the Iranian budget, the defense and security sectors have been extremely well funded. So it's more likely that these funds will be used to relieve some of the pressures on the rising poverty and the extenuating circumstances brought about by a declining economy, for no other reason than to improve the atmosphere by the public towards the government, and to help reduce the amount of grievances that are at the moment sloshing around in Iran.
Foad, so we were just talking about what impact this deal might have on President Biden in the U.S. I want to ask you about how this deal might potentially help President Raisi in Iran. What has the reaction been thus far from the general public? From your point of view, do you think this is something that will strengthen him among his supporters? Or do you think this is something that could potentially, cause him any kind of political peril in Iran?
I think the agreement yesterday, the exchange, is going to help President Raisi internally. He is showing that he's able to achieve these type of agreements. It's going to help Iran with its finances. So Iranians are happy. Americans are happy, with the exception of some Republicans and some professors that are missing the points on Iran. And South Koreans are happy because they can have normal economic relations with Iran, given the fact that this issue is off the table. Israelis are not happy for obvious reasons. The Israeli-supported Iranian opposition is obviously not happy. But overall, I think this was a good agreement. And if Biden wants to have a correct policy towards Iran, he could return to the agreement today. I teach American government at the University of Tehran. Under the American system, the new president can nullify the executive orders of the previous president. So what Biden could do on the first day of his presidency, and what he could do today, is to return to the agreement, give Iran 2 or 3 months to go back to compliance, and Iran would do that probably in just a few weeks. The fact that we are having this conversation is because of the chaos in Washington and because of the wrong recommendations that people in the US government are getting from the so-called Iran experts that seems to know nothing about Iran.
Scott, we only have about a minute and a half left, but I could see that you wanted to jump in, so please go ahead.
I think at the end of the day, trying to blame one side or just the other, well, that's just a bit of posturing, and we can put that aside. The fact of the matter is that there is two fundamentals here. One is that we have got a very limited deal, which Iran struck because it needed money for its economy. We need to have good faith measures on both sides to advance on the nuclear program. But secondly, the equally important story this week was the fact of the ongoing protest in Iran for rights, for reform, for justice. The Iranian leadership, in part, tried to use this story to deflect from those protests, which they have brutally tried to repress. And going into 2024, as important as the nuclear deal is as a topic of discussion, equally as important are those social movements within Iran trying to find space to freely express themselves and not be repressed. So we'll be watching both stories at the same time.
And Fuad, I also saw you. I saw you wanted to jump in there, Fuad. Please go ahead.
Stop sanctioning Iranian people. If you are interested in human rights of Iranians, stop sanctioning them instead of increasing sanctions.
I know the Iranian people. I know the Iranian people. I taught at your institute in Tehran. My friends are at your institute in Tehran.
Yes.
I know the Iranian
I know that
people.
was a mistake.
I hope you will speak honestly about the Iranian people. Don't lecture me about the Iranian people.
The honest thing is that Iranians don't like to be sanctioned. And supporting sanctions against Iranian people is unjustified, it's immoral, and it's a corrupt policy practice. It's not going to work out.
They want rights and social freedoms as well, don't they?
All right. Well,
they have rights. They have social freedoms. They don't need any recommendations from people like you. Thank you.
Fuad, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Foad Izadi, Roxane Farmanfarmaian, and Scott Lucas. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.